Brexit. What has happened quite simply since the referendum is that the Conservative Party has gradually become the Leave campaign. It has purged itself of its old pro-European liberal wing. It may not be dead, they may come back, I don't know, but they got rid of the members of Parliament, or they got rid of themselves, who constituted that wing of the party all the way back to the 1960s. And the Conservative Party is now united around what we used to think of as a hard line on Brexit. The Labour Party, on the other hand, was divided. And the opposition to the Conservative Party generally was divided. The Labour Party is a bit like the Conservative Party in the old days, split between two wings. The British Labour Party is a combination of, I simplify enormously, urban intellectuals of the left and the working classes. It is now stuck with the intellectual left university cities, most of London, and odd pockets elsewhere, but what used to be its industrial base in parts of the country where there used to be coal mines, there used to be steel mills, and a long, painful process of adaptation as those industries faded has been taking place. Those electorates deserted the Labour Party in sufficient numbers for the Conservative Party to have a large majority. They have a majority of 80. So that means, don't forget, British system, no constitution, second chamber largely ceremonial and not very ineffectual. A British Prime Minister with a majority behind him or her in the House of Commons is one of the most powerful politicians in the Western world. There are very few countervailing powers. There is no constitution and therefore not much judicial review of the constitutionality of parliamentary legislation or governmental action. There is a huge problem, which is that Scotland in the same election elected with an even bigger majority than the Conservatives have in the country as a whole, the Scottish National Party, which wants a second referendum on Scottish independence. That will be a big, big issue to be watched carefully by you political scientists in the next 5 years, with all sorts of ramifications for other countries with irredentist regions. I don't have to tell you which ones they are. One of them is not far from here, Spain, obviously, a big, big issue. Will the Scots be tempted to do a Catalan-style illegal referendum? I doubt it. For the simple reason that if they did, I open parentheses, the easiest thing for the pro-unionist, pro-UK people would simply be not to go and vote, and then to say, look, this whole thing is ridiculous because not many people voted. And so far, the Scottish National Party, to be fair, has been absolutely scrupulously constitutionalist in saying we have to have an act of the British Parliament authorising us to have a referendum in Scotland. But watch that one carefully. And then we have Ireland. Now, a word on Ireland. Irish people here before I put my British foot in it. Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is constitutionally part of the United Kingdom, geographically part of the island of Ireland, obviously. It therefore has a land border with Ireland and therefore with the EU, because Ireland is the EU. It was obvious from the very beginning, and the British were warned, that if they voted to leave the EU, one of the first problems that would have to be addressed would be the Irish border. This is not an economic issue. This is a matter of literally life or death. This is a border which was, until 20 years ago, heavily militarized, with tanks and watchtowers and people getting shot, army presence, every car, every lorry stopped, opened, looking for explosives. Why? Because the settlement which the British thought they had imposed, because at the time it was an imposition, when Ireland became independent at the beginning of the 20th century, didn't work. So why does Northern Ireland exist? Well, quite simply, when Irish nationalism emerged as a political force in the late 19th and early 20th century, it was largely seen as, and to be fair, largely was, a movement of Irish Catholics, the vast majority of the country being Roman Catholic. There were famous Protestant nationalists as well, but they were famous largely because they were exceptional. The Protestant inhabitants of Ireland, who were descendants of families, often aristocratic families, sent from England and Scotland to Ireland to pacify the local community and to make Ireland better disposed to the British and ultimately to make it British. They were largely concentrated in the north of Ireland, and some of them began to say, we don't want to be independent and Irish, we want to remain British. And as the problem grew, and as the First World War became 1914, 1918, the time when this issue really emerged as a powerful one in British politics, the compromise reached, you Belgians would have done it better, no doubt, was to draw a line on the map and say, okay, this bit will remain in the UK, the rest of it will be an independent country. Ireland has 32 counties. 6 of them are in Northern Ireland, 26 of them are in the south. We call it the south, in fact it's the south and a little bit the northwest. It doesn't quite work geographically. So 26 are in the Republic of Ireland, which is an independent republic, has the euro as its currency, has full membership of the European Union. And the 6 counties are in the UK. They have the pound, they have the Queen, etc., etc. That might have worked if Northern Ireland had been 100% Protestant and Republic of Ireland had been 100% Catholic. But of course, it's not like that unless you really do ethnic cleansing, which nobody even there wanted to do. So there is, and always has been, in Northern Ireland, a Protestant majority and a Catholic minority. Now, leave religion aside, in political terms, that more or less translates as a unionist majority. Unionist means stay with the UK. And a Republican or nationalist, meaning we want to be Irish, minority. And the majority did, I'm afraid, what majorities often do. They abused their power, and were allowed to abuse their power, in all sorts of discriminatory practices, access to the professions, promotion in the civil service, appointment of judges, the police service, and employment altogether. We arrived at a situation in the 1960s where the Catholic, Republican, nationalist minority thought that it was getting a raw deal and began to protest, first of all, peacefully. Don't forget, we're talking about the late 1960s. where there is great effervescence in world politics anyway, the Vietnam War, liberation movements, decolonization, and gradually armed warfare broke out, a civil war, not very widespread, but pretty bad. And when I was a child, and I was 14 in 1968 when it really broke out, you had every night on television Vietnam and Northern Ireland. And it frankly looked pretty similar, except Northern Ireland, the streets were the streets I was familiar with because you had the same shops as you had in England. So Northern Ireland for a period of time was a bloody place, and I have to do a fast forward here because I want to give you time to ask questions. Finally, after a lengthy process of consultation, discussion, negotiation, with the help of the United States of America, with the help of the European Union, in Tony Blair's time, a peace agreement was reached. It was signed on Good Friday, the Friday of Easter. It's called the Good Friday Agreement, known as the Belfast Agreement as well, signed in Belfast as the capital of Northern Ireland. And it introduced a new system of governance in Northern Ireland and a much better system of protection of minority rights in employment, in the civil service, in the judiciary, and a power-sharing system in government where essentially the main Unionist party and the main Nationalist party have to work together. One is the Prime Minister, the other is the Deputy, and Irish people, Northern Irish people were given the assurance that they alone would decide their future. So both Britain and Ireland, the UK and Ireland, said, we will not impose a solution. The Irish changed their constitution to remove the territorial claim on the 6 counties, and the British said, the Northern Irish will remain British until they want to be something else, and if they decide to be something else, we will not stand in their way. And lo and behold, it worked. The border is now a peaceful one. People go backwards and forwards. Businesses do their transactions backwards and forwards. People feel at home on either side. The Northern Irish minority feels, I think, more comfortable than it used to. And the two countries have better bilateral relations than they ever have had before. The Queen of England went to visit Ireland in what was considered to be a remarkable event. The Irish President made a reciprocal state visit to the UK, where he had all the great dinners in Buckingham Palace that you get if you're a friendly head of state, and so on. So relations are great. And then comes Brexit. And once the British said, immediately after the referendum, we're leaving the European Union, and we understand that to mean that we are leaving the European customs territory and the European single market. That wasn't an answer to a referendum question, that was a policy choice, but it's one which I think we have to say now has been endorsed by the electorate. The problem was, well, what are we going to do in Ireland? Oh, everybody said immediately the border must remain open. Again, it's not a matter of economics, it is, but it's a matter of life or death. We're not going back to the bad old days. There will be no infrastructure at the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. You have to understand, most of you, I guess, haven't been there, it's not a natural border. There's no mountain, there's no river. It goes through towns. It's a bit like the Belgian-Dutch border, which is a line on a map. Similarly, I mean, to be honest, I mean, again, putting my foot in it, Antwerp could have been in the Netherlands, Breda could have been in Belgium, I suppose. It's where the armies stopped and where diplomats drew lines on a map. It's not like Spain and France, got a big mountain range in the middle. Some borders are natural, some are not. This is a very unnatural border. It goes through farms, it goes through villages, pretty difficult to control. But suddenly it becomes a border between the EU and a foreign country. The UK is about to become, 31st of January, a third country, as is the EU jargon. Now, unless you have a special agreement, that means it's a customs border. Everything coming into the EU has to be assessed for EU customs duties, excise duties, what's its origin, what's its value. That's what happens in the port of Antwerp when ships arrive. It's what happens at the external land borders when you go from, Belarus into Poland. It's a border. The UK's left. Nobody asked them to leave, but they're leaving. What are we going to do? So from the very beginning of the negotiations, this was a big problem. The UK says, we want to leave, we want to take back control, we want our own trade policy, but Ireland's different. So the Europeans said, well, is it very different? Do you want a special regime for Ireland? No, they said. How dare you interfere in the territorial integrity of the United Kingdom? It's part of the United Kingdom. It must be treated in the same way. So they wanted it to be treated in the same way, but somehow differently. And that's one of the reasons that the last three, not the only one, it's one of the reasons the last 3 years have been so difficult. What's going to happen now? We're going to leave on the 31st of January. On Friday, what's today? Tuesday? It's 3 days' time, the withdrawal bill will go back to the House of Commons, which will no doubt approve it this time. Mr. Johnson has a majority. So there'll be no parliamentary delays. And that agreement will be ratified by the European Parliament and will enter into force. What does it say? It says that until the end of 2020, nothing changes. It has special provisions regarding Northern Ireland. It has special provisions making the UK pay what the Europeans think it owes into the EU budget, and preserving the rights of EU citizens in the UK and British citizens in the member states until the end of 2020. What happens at the end of 2020? Well, unless an agreement has been reached, it means that the UK becomes a foreign country like any other without any contractual agreements with the EU. It is simply a foreign country. We're all members of the World Trade Organization, we're all members of the UN, but there's no special agreement between us. Do we need an agreement? Most people, I think yes, we do. We are neighbors. Our economies are closely intertwined. European cars are made from bits in the UK and bits in continental Europe, where they're put together. Airbus wings are made in Wales and sent to Toulouse, where they're screwed onto the rest of the plane. So nobody really thinks that leaving with no agreement is a good idea. But what can be agreed in 11 months? We wake up on the 1st of February, we've left the EU. The deadline for the end of the transition is the 31st of December. So there are 11 months to make an agreement. How easy or difficult is it going to be? That is the big question for the next few weeks and months. On the pro side saying it's going to be easy, the UK has today the same laws as the EU in most relevant areas. So should be pretty easy to say we'll have an agreement based largely on those rules. Yes, say the British, but we want to diverge. And you, in the future, you will make new laws about banks and about what constitutes mineral water and what you like in your chickens and whether you're prepared to have GMO in your food. And we might not make laws like that. We're an independent sovereign country now. So part of the challenge is going to be how to provide for future, almost inevitable, regulatory divergence. I don't know. The British have to decide, and they haven't begun to have this debate yet properly, how much trade-off they accept between access to markets and regulatory alignment. The Europeans will say, if you want the same sort of access to our market as you've had up to now, you have to have rules which are pretty similar to ours. And we need to find a mechanism to assess how aligned they are. And by the way, we want to have the last word in deciding whether we think they are and whether we think, what consequences we think flow from divergence which we find unacceptable. That's not going to be easy. It's difficult enough with physical goods. It's even more difficult for services. Services are increasingly important in the world economy. Mr. Johnson has said, I am not going to extend the transitional period. He could. He could ask for it. The withdrawal agreement says that by the 1st of July, there can be an agreement to extend the transition period for up to 2 years. He has said, I'm not going to ask for that. And he's even said today, I'm going to ask Parliament to put in the law that the British Prime Minister cannot ask for an extension to the deadline. Which leaves open the question whether the other side asks and whether he can agree or not. But let's assume that he is sincere. There's not going to be an extension. So the real challenge is, and I'll stop on this point, in the next 12 months from today, there has to be an agreement or an understanding of the consequences of a failure to agree on the relationship between the UK and the rest of its continent. This, frankly, is not something that should be done in a year. It requires quite a lot of deliberation and consideration, but we are where we are in the politics and the law. It will set the course of the UK-Europe relationship for a long time, and will have an influence for those of you from the rest of the world, the non-Europeans here. It will have a considerable impact on the way both the UK and the EU relate to other countries in the world as well, and the way those other countries relate to the UK and to the EU. I'll stop there. Very happy to take